is actually the seminar. So we start our thesis class at 2 o'clock. So I'm going to go over the the brief, and I'm going to go over all the deadlines, but this is a different class. So, you know, we're going to move into a different Zoom in. So I'm just, and also I'm going to say just a few words about these times, you guys. I mean, we begin our thesis in the strangest of times, and anyway, so I think that we're all in the same boat, and we're all, you know, really struggling to go through this, you know, last few days and the last few months as well. So anyway, so shifting towards what we're going to do first in our class, which is going to be our miniatures exhibition. Let me see if I do play. Do you guys see? Do you still see me? Just say, Giovanna, say okay or not. I see. I have you right next, Giovanna. So the first person I see, and I see Lorenzo and Yash. Yes. So you see. Okay, good. So this is welcome to SCI-Arc graduate thesis 2020. This is our first step. So Elena had asked me to present for the seminar, but it's a little bit of, you know, kind of presentation for the class as well. I want to try to go fast because I have to start again at 2 o'clock. So, so this is miniatures. The miniatures this year is going to be different than last year's miniature, as you can imagine, but we're trying to make what is different to be unique at the same time. So it is different, but it's unique, meaning that we had 5 years of a particular kind of miniatures, and we're going to have the first year of a special kind of miniatures. So I try to put some examples of, you know, how you think, how we can think through what is a miniature and how we work through miniatures. As you know, miniatures generally was more geared towards, let me just see the chat. I had the Slack sounding. I can't. So if you guys have a question for me, you have to let me know, because I can't. In order to see a question, I have to stop my play. So anyway, so miniatures, as I said before, it was very much about the relationship with the museum. So miniatures was very much about an exhibition. You know, how do we think through one object, one drawing, one video? You know, I don't know if you remember, but miniature really had different formats, but how we can think through one object and the constraints of that object. In our case, since we're not artists, so we don't build sculptures or paintings, the idea of the miniatures is that a miniature is a scale model or a scale object. It could be like a small version of a drawing, or it could be a small version of a drawing. And also the idea is that you begin miniatures and you have 1 month to really develop something that you guys imagine is going to be your final project. So for many years in thesis, in Elena, myself, and many people here have been teaching thesis for several years, I don't know, 15 years or something like that here at SCI-Arc. And you know, sometimes the beginning of a thesis is what really kind of needs somehow kind of an acceleration. So in a way, the miniatures exhibition was always an acceleration to try to get to the end before you reach the end. So miniatures is again a small version of your larger project. Now, thinking that it's a model doesn't mean that you have to stay in the model, you know, or that it's an object. An object could be a drawing, it could be an animation. Now it could be something in virtual reality and so on. So we're going to ask from every student is to make a miniature. We mentioned before that we could 3D print and so on at SCI-Arc, but we're still not in that phase in the school in terms of the ability to have people in the school. So we have few options. I'll go over that when I introduce at 2 o'clock, but the idea is that we still want to have an exhibition at SCI-Arc. So we're going to ask the students to make a model that is a bounding box of 1 foot by 1 foot out of anything. Could be a toilet paper model. It could be a bunch of coffee cups models. So it could be a drawing. So I'm just going to go through examples through art and so on, so you can do your 1-foot size object, more miniature. So what miniature has, and the theme of the presentation today has to do with meaning, not so much the miniature. You know, one thing that is going to link all the examples is that everything is meaning. You know, everything is a kind of micro or small version of something else. So I'm going to begin with the ready-made, with a mini ready-made, like a version of a mini ready-made. And I think that the most famous mini ready-made is the traveling or box in a suitcase done by Marcel Duchamp in 1935. So what is interesting about this mini exhibition is that, you know, everything had to fit in a suitcase. So, you know, it had to be either fold up or kind of, you know, assemble there. And the collection that he made of that, he made a selection of items, some that are his own works and some works that are, you know, known works or fellow works and so on. So it was a kind of a collection on this suitcase. You know, there were many versions of the suitcase. The suitcase, the original was wood, and then it was a box and so on. See that you can still buy a suitcase, a box. So the idea for him was that what is original and what is a copy is that in the world, you know, the idea of reproduction, you know, so what is the meaning of an original if you can really create copies of that? You can do mini copies of that. You can do kind of micro copies. So the suitcase, and also what is the role of a museum? What is the role of the collection? How many pieces do you collect? What do you like to collect? And so on. I think it was interesting to see that idea of both, of the kind of taking away power to the museum and putting the power onto a box, and also the idea of like a selection process. What do you do with that selection? How many elements you have in the selection? And the idea that it's malleable, like can go to different places, you know, like suitcase. So this, you know, is all, again, this is a photo not of Duchamp, but a friend of his, André Breton, from 1960s. So I wanted to kind of emphasize that idea of your kind of personal collection, you know, like the things that you carried on, the things that you select, the way that you present them. So you can see him with his own collection, you know, and also André Breton with this idea that things are not singular, you know, like the things don't have one medium. You know, there's no such a thing as a medium specificity. So he's talking about this is a poem or this is an object. So another thing that we can break on is the notion that you have a medium specificity within what you do. You can really kind of open that and allow for multiple mediums to come in. This is a painting, this is a sculpture, or these are ready-made, these are trash, this is a poem, you know. So that idea that is neither or, I think that is you know, quite interesting on this piece of work. So one thing I think that you work through, and in a way the beginning of thesis could be, you know, remember that it doesn't mean that if you're going to do like a museum, you're going to do a mini museum and then a larger museum. You might work with an abstraction of an idea that you're working with. You might work with a collection of something, or you might work with a design process of something, and then you put it together, you know. Like I think it's interesting in Duchamp's case is this kind of broad oeuvre that he's talking about, and not the singularity of the painting or the object. So I wanted to talk about this idea of miniatures, also has to do with collection. You know, historically you had a cabinet of wonders that, you know, there were collections that people had in their homes. There were things that you would collect, rarities and so on. So, you know, you might collect this kind of small few elements. And the idea of the kind of the cabinet of curiosities, which I think in a way at the beginning of thesis, you're a little bit set up in that frame where you in thesis prep, you were collecting a lot of things. You were looking at many variables. You are not addressing a single one. You also thinking in terms that you were thinking in a pre-digital moment, you know, in a way, or a pre-COVID-19 moment where you could, you know, you had you know, kind of different kind of range of objects to work with. You know, now, you know, you have your collection might be more constrained, but it doesn't mean that it's less imaginative. And what is interesting about these cabinets is that the idea that you must live with those objects. I think somebody has no, it's not muted. Elena, you're the host, so you can mute everybody, and I will unmute myself. So the idea that, you know, you almost living, I just wanted to put that idea for you guys, that you might be living with your collection, you know, that notion that since you have to be imaginative about how you do this object, how you work with this object, or maybe it's like, it's, you know, it's digital, so you might submit a file, you might film a file as if it was a model. So, you know, you really have a kind of a more ample, a broad spectrum, and you're living within that, you know, that space. You know, again, you know, these drawings are representations of real collections. You know, the Flemish were quite acute at painting and defining whether there's like certain machines to how they were doing these such precise paintings, but they're always kind of collections of objects. Also objects of the domestic space. You know, I think that is something also to bring to our miniatures, is that the domestic environment has a different role to what it had before. Like the domestic space, this is my office, this is my home, this is my restaurant, this is my gym, this is my supermarket now, if you're kind of hoarding too much. And so almost as if that domestic environment, it is that world that we have. So you have those elements, they're surrounding you, but they have a richness that you would observe. So the idea of converting your mind from an observer to a collector, you know, has to do with that, you know, almost as if it's, I mean, this, again, these are bags, you know, but it could be, you know, you're collecting coffee beans. The difference between a coffee bean and a grain of salt. So, you know, like there's things that you haven't looked at that you start to kind of pay attention to. And then you start to kind of create a kind of a bit of an anxiety within those collections, you know, so looking at the different things that you see, the different places where you find ideas, that is not only within the screen, but it's within kind of the kind of enclosed physicality, which, you know, again, these are collections of travels through nature, or they would like, you know, and then there were catalog. You see contemporary artists in this type of work as well. Damien Hirst really takes on this cabinet of curiosities, advances the cabinet of curiosities. Another artist that is quite interesting is Henry Cueco. And this is a contemporary artist. And then what is interesting about this is that it's the kind of conversion from the ready-made or the found object, the found butterfly, or the found element, into a transcript of that. You know, in this case, a kind of a catalog as a drawing, you know, or a more realistic drawing of those. And yet it's still, you know, it's kind of transferring the information you found the objects or the rocks or the items, you represent them, you start to find the catalog of differences, and so on. So again, you know, being surrounded by collectible items, being surrounded by things that have unique forms, that have unique colors, that have unique materials. You know, again, so back to, you can see where Duchamp took on his idea of this cabinet, of this museum, of this kind of traveling museum. The idea, in this case, were originals. In his case, he's also challenging what is an original, what is a reproduction, even with objects that are not original, but actually are reproductions because they're mass produced. So in this case, the kind of uniqueness of the object, you know, is kind of, in Duchamp's case, is kind of challenged by the idea of the artificiality of the object. So again, another view of that cabinet, you know, of the, and also the items, you know, again, as I was saying, that the miniature doesn't have to be necessarily a sculpture or an object. It could be something like this. It could be something that is sets up a collection. It could be a mini object I cannot point out here, but you can see the urinal, and you can see some of the items actually constructed in small space. So you know, it jumps a bit fast into Rauschenberg, and then looking at, I mean, I just wanted to mention Rauschenberg on relationship to Duchamp. Of course, these are the earlier work of Rauschenberg. The idea that these collections are kind of collapsed more, and then you have the original. This is one of the first paintings that Rauschenberg did while he was a student at Black Mountain College. He was a student of Albers at that time, and so he created the stage for some of the performances that were taking place at Black Mountain College, and he did it with a mixture of fabrics, you know, because they had you know, it was a little bit like an extension of the Bauhaus, of the kind of American version of the Bauhaus. Right, you know, actually all the people that had to leave Germany due to the war and due to what was happening there, had to come here and then start teaching, you know, in this environment that is similar to that. So all the arts collapse. And so for Rauschenberg, he's working on this, you know, so it's a stage, and it also works, you know, as a painting. And again, you know, the kind of the found objects, the kind of the assemblage of things of the domestic environment. So that within the box of Duchamp, you know, of course, there's a reference to the role of the machine. You know, what does the machine can do? The large glass is one of the objects you might have seen within that box. And so I just wanted to show miniatures from architects as well. So this is Super Studio. You know, they're presenting this assembly, this kind of machine that dissolves history in a way. These are salt models of iconic archetypes, and they're made of salt. And what happens is that this machine throws water at them and dissolves these archetypes. You know, they disappear. You know, so that idea of this, you know, time, you know, is a kind of it's both. It's a construction as a deconstruction or destruction of the icon. And then the machine is heavily calibrated, is arranged, it functions, you know, has a function of this kind of the creation and then the destruction of those architectural archetypes. So Super Studio, you might know some of the work. I'm not going to go into much detail, but these are images. This is not actually an image of Super Studio, it's an image of the new domestic landscape, which was an exhibition that took place at the MoMA. And Super Studio presented this, Emilio Ambas was the curator, and then they had this amazing model and some miniature models of environments. The idea that you can create a completely artificial environment. So these amazing spaces were quite immersive, work with reflection, work with the abstraction of the grid, and work with actual nature or actual elements of nature. So, you know, even for the way that they saw the grid, the expansion of the grid, that you all know all of their diagrams and collages, but that it really has no scale. So you can really work at the scale of one-to-one object, as almost as a piece of furniture, and then you can work at the scale of a building or even a city. The next mini version, it would be the idea of the mini image or the micro image. So the mini image, and for this, of course, we need help from Rauschenberg. And I like just to show these images of the kind of the jump in scale, you know. So you call this the collages that he uses as a departure point, but you can also, you know, they are miniatures, kind of miniatures to his large paintings. And the way that they were creating his paintings were quite large. They almost work at the scale of advertising in cities, because he actually was originally mural painter. And so this idea that you go from the magazine clip, you know, the collage of the ready-made, which is the magazine clip, to the scale of the large painting. So you can see here both, you know, being presented there. In later years, he started to kind of abstract those collages, you know, some new things start to come. He started to use different layers to the painting. It was not only the jumping from, the image or the cutout to that. And then again, you can see here the scale. You know, he needs this machine to paint the paintings due to the scale. But the paintings in the end really work the way that he worked in advertising, you know, in big buildings. He created a grid, you know, the image was broken down into a grid. There's things that happen to the paintings or to the ads, you know, like shredding through an image, you know, shredding through a ready-made, a technique you will call crosshatch, you know, so that idea of cutting the image and exposing multiple layers or multiple images throughout at different scales and at different elements. I mean, you can see here how the panels are made. You imagine that these are really small images. I'll show you a few examples. And here you see how it was assembled together out of large, you know, out of kind of large units. So again, you know, the image brings a reference, and then he starts to kind of break down that image and then convert it into, you know, into a new image. And again, you have the elements of ready-mades, the found objects, and the way that they're stitched together, how he finds way to kind of stitch them together. They'll be taped together like here. You can see in the final paintings, the moments where things are stitched, the moments. You see the grid here for the expansion for the mini image or at the scale of a magazine. So you imagine what is the size of these drawings. And then how they come together. What are the elements that bring them together? And then how many layers he starts to bring onto that. You can see he begins with the image from the magazine, then he adds a layer, a vellum on top. That vellum on top gets the idea of the color range. From the color range, then he finds another image that starts to work with the grid. So there's a kind of a translation process onto how you look at the collages, and then they become paintings. You know, different than Rauschenberg, where you see the stuff, the domestic stuff. You have a piece of a chair that is stuck into the painting. You know, here there's a translation system, and also the idea that things are domestic and yet they have a double meaning. You know, like a hair dryer that looks like a missile, or the worms that look like the worms, the spaghettis that look like worms. You know, so it has this kind of doubling of what something that is quite if it's quite ordinary becomes this kind of, has this power or kind of extraordinary power. And again, the domestic environment always present, you know, within all of these iterations. So here, I think it's nice to see. This is how small it is. This is probably like 10 by 10. And this is an image of the crosshatch. You can even see below, you know, the tape to frame. You know, you always need to frame something. But I thought that the outline of the unframed piece is quite interesting. You see fashion summers, you know, you see all of the elements from those ready-made that he's using, that then he would cut. He would, again, the originals, you know, the originals to those really large paintings. And that idea, the kind of recognition of the elements, the recognition of the brand. You see later that, you see that, of course, in Warhol, you would see that, you know, in many examples. And the way that I use, again, this is, you saw the earlier sketches or the earlier drawings. This is a few layers later onto that painting, and you can see there's more elements that create a lot more abstraction, and yet the kind of power of the elements and things that are, again, ordinary that become extraordinary. It's interesting to see the grid, because the grid will give you a sense from this mini drawing. Again, these are really small, onto how this will really take shape in a huge museum, you know, in the space of the museum. And the numbering of that, the grid, you can see here on pencil, the grid of that drawing, almost as if he could actually do it at different scales. So that miniature, that mini drawing really helps him to kind of expanding. These are some images of his own history as a, illustrator, as a art painter, on the streets of New York. The other mini that I wanted to talk about is that idea of the mini world. So how you start to kind of see these environments, these miniatures as worlds in themselves. So for that, I don't know if any of you saw these are not necessarily photos of that exhibition, but Hauser and Wirtz had an amazing exhibition of Mike Kelly called Candors. And it was absolutely fantastic. Maybe it was at the time when you guys started SCI-Arc 2 years ago. I don't recall exactly when this was up. But what it was fantastic is that it really allowed you to enter the environments that he was creating. So Candors begins with a kind of borrowing from a cartoon, borrowing from a kind of from a story, a kind of cartoonish story from Superman, the worlds that are created. I like to see these small collages of things that he found, where the ideas come from, where he's kind of borrowing these ideas. I have to go faster. So again, so he creates these small worlds, and the narratives, can talk later about where the narratives are coming from, but these are, these are references to kryptonite and all of these elements of the worlds where Superman is coming from. So, but then you find this, again, how you confine the world, how you define that space. I really like these studies that he did with stuff that you find in a fish store, that you can create a mason jar. So your miniature could be a mason jar, by the way. So what you put inside of that mason jar grows into being one of these amazing objects. Your model could be made out of jello. So this is what I'm saying, that you have to think through how you look at some of these examples, how you look at the world in different ways. Other Kelly examples of this kind of jewel, these are the jewels that are kind of laid as a painting. So it's interesting because you see, and I'm just running through some Kelly stuff. To my Kelly stuff, this is another exhibition where he's creating this new objects out of the cutest units that you can find, which is the splash toys hanging and becoming robust and yet quite obscure. This is some of the kind of the earlier crochet pieces of Mike Kelly. I think that this is an image. This is a book that that Wendy recommended me. I have all the books here, by the way. This is the Wes Anderson. We used it a bit for the studio last semester. So that idea, the creation of the world, what I found interesting about Wes Anderson is that the creation of the world has to do with the kind of the physicality of the spaces. Almost as if all his worlds are always rooms. Like there's no, there are landscapes. The landscapes actually are painted as flat. And this is fantastic, Mr. Fox. For this, everything is underground. Therefore, they're caves. So they are rooms. So that idea that you can look at the room, that room that I was saying that you are inhabiting, could have a lot of narratives. The domestic space is always here in his examples. And the domestic elements, the catalog of, he would start a movie, he would choose everything for that movie. Everything has to be matching to the time that he's selecting, to the elements that were used at that time, to the colors that they have, the graphics, and even if he had to kind of redesign them. In a way, you start to, and again, here's like it's a ship, it's a fake ship that they actually built in 1:1 scale. So it's not a miniature, it's actually a large. And then the idea that it's about the sequence of rooms, almost as a sequence of stage, very theatrical in that sense. So for that, I thought that for all of you that are creating these worlds, you could also think about how you create a script. the script of your thesis will be quite important.
I'm just looking up.
Ale, yeah. So the, I think, so somebody had a question? So the idea of the script, I think, is going to be quite important for everybody, because we're going to be defining how you're going to present your narrative for your project, how you're going to build it up, what are the different stages. You're going to make small films, small videos of you presenting your thesis, maybe you using a green screen, maybe you using a video, small homemade video, creating an animation, you know, but we're going to look, in this case, your layout will be a script. So you will build up the narrative, you will even draw that narrative. So the last one it's called just mini, which is mini has to do with, so from a miniature we move to a mini, like anything mini micro that you start to find. So you know, for that I wanted to show an example. This is a small book that after conversation with Paola Antonelli, she sent me this book of an exhibition that she had created, which is called Humble Masterpieces. They look at, and she is the curator of architecture and design, design objects. She now has an amazing exhibition nobody can see, but you can see online happening. So what is interesting is that the whole book is a catalog of how you find uniqueness in everyday objects. So a Band-Aid, you know, so Band-Aid from afar, and also the story of how these humble elements, domestic things that you have at home. I mean, you can do this book at your home. You don't have to go find them, buy them, you can just do them. So all of the elements, for her, they have a story of when was the time they were invented, you know, a kind of an interesting narrative. At the same time, they have a power, they have of their qualities, of their materials, of their geometries. Again, you know, your model could be made out of Jello, could be made out of spaghetti, could be made out of chocolate, could be made out of candy. So if you good photos before they decay, but if you start to think that you can have these humble elements, these humble masterpieces, and these humble masterpieces, once they're photographed, they become extraordinary. So from the ordinary elements to the kind of extraordinary, you know, possibilities that you can have with them. So again, you know, even past are amazing. So if you think a bit, if you think that miniature is actually a small world, it's also, let me go to the grid of images. Miniature is, the miniature is, as I mentioned, you know, all the miniatures, it could be made, everything here in this presentation actually has an emphasis on the ready-made, because it's like that idea that is what you have. But the idea that you start to look at, you know, how you work through, again, salt, you have, you know, found objects and so on. The image, the idea that, again, it might not, miniature, your miniature model doesn't necessarily have to be an object. It could be a drawing on a suitcase or in a box, or just standing there, or just you're photographing. It could be an animation. So the idea of the mini world is something that you enter, but when you do it as an animated, you should design it also to be set up in that space of the 1-to-1, 1 foot by 1 foot world. So even though it is, it's digital, it's still encased within that kind of small world. Or just things that are small, you know, what are the potentials of the things that are just small? So with that, I end. Elena, I don't know if you're there. Or if anybody has a question, maybe you can save the question for at 2 p.m. when I log in again into another Zoom, just in case other people comes to them that Zoom.
Yes, I turned off my video so I could make sure that it would record properly.